Warning: this video contains subject material that some may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. This video also contains major spoilers for Until Dawn, Man of Medan, and Little Hope. So, Man of Medan was a bit of a letdown. Yeah, that's right, I can't even move on to the next game without giving the previous one a final knife in the gut. It had a lot of interesting elements and even surpassed Until Dawn in a few areas, but it ultimately failed to impress. So once the video was done and uploaded, I started the next Dark Pictures anthology game, Little Hope, expecting it to be on about the same level. After finishing it 6 times and earning the Platinum Trophy, I was overjoyed to have played a game that not only blows Man of Medan out of the water, but arguably even measures up favourably to Until Dawn. That's right, Little Hope is brilliant. It takes a lot of the elements that made Man of Medan less adequate and somehow makes them work. It's got a genuinely tragic story that nearly brought me to tears at one point, and it's all undercut by a mystery that you can't figure out from the opening cutscene. While I am going to spend the next however long banging on about how good Little Hope is, it is not a perfect game. Not by a long shot. So in the interest of fairness, I am going to start by going over where Little Hope falls short. Let's start simple. The premonitions are still rubbish. There is exactly one that is worthwhile. Mercy, which shows Andrew helping Angela, who is being pursued by a chained monster. This is good. Helping Angela is the correct decision in this situation, so it's an actual reward for searching the environment and paying attention. The rest of the premonitions are on par with Man of Medan's. That is to say, they are completely ineffective and the game would have been better without them. Little Hope also messes up the bearings. Bearings were a feature of Man of Medan modelled after Until Dawn's butterflies. They're a way to track how your major choices have impacted the story. Man of Medan did them just fine, which is why I didn't bother mentioning them until now, but Little Hope completely drops the ball. In my first playthrough, I constantly saw the bearing updated icon during cutscenes I had no control over. I thought at first that maybe your decisions could slightly alter the events of these cutscenes, but nope. A chunk of Little Hope's bearings ironically has no bearing on your decisions. I would say that they're glorified story recap modules, but they're not even that. A commonly reported bug meant that most, if not all of the bearings were completely out of order, so they can't even adequately track the cause and effects of your decisions, which is what they're for. While we're on the topic of bugs, this game is janky as hell. Man of Medan had its share of visual glitches, but Little Hope takes it to a whole new level. First, there are straight up bugs, like when Daniel slides into place when you gain control in the park, or how if you see the execution of Taylor's doppelganger with either a high relationship with Daniel or the burning demon after her, the following conversation crashes the game. But then other parts are just poorly designed, like how Taylor will freak out about the fog even if she's experienced it already. Or how when she and Daniel are running from the burn demon, you'll see Taylor running ahead, only for her to teleport behind over the span of a few shots. The system in which you get different dialogue depending on your decisions has also been implemented poorly. The most egregious example is that if you don't mess with Vince, he just randomly calls out to you at the factory and then does nothing else. Hey! If you have acted antagonistically, he'll tell you that the police are on their way, and the scene isn't so awkward. Hey!
They're coming! You can't keep running! I'll make sure they'll find you!
But apparently they really needed to have him show up here, even if he has nothing to say. Lastly, the way characters who aren't Andrew get plot armor at random points in order to bottleneck the story is ridiculous. Man of Medan has exactly one obvious bottleneck. One moment where it is impossible for someone in a deadly situation to die if you've lost too many characters already. This bottleneck occurs when Olsen is chasing Alex and Julia. If you've got enough characters alive that you can kill one here and still have 3 left, one of these characters will be blocking the door, delaying Alex and Julia just long enough for Olsen to grab one of them. If you don't have enough characters, no one will be there and you'll have enough time to escape no matter what. The lack of bottlenecks is a testament to just how adaptive Man of Medan's story is, and the creative way the only real bottleneck is executed shows an attention to detail and a desire to tell a consistent narrative. Little Hope, as far as I can tell, has 4 bottlenecks. 1 for John and 3 for Taylor. Taylor basically can't die unless she's the first or second. If Daniel dies outside the church, Taylor won't. If Daniel and Angela are already dead when she's snuck up on, she can't be killed. If John is the last man standing with Andrew, he will always survive his confrontation with the crushed demon. All of these outcomes are guaranteed, regardless of the mistakes you made or the QTEs you fail. These bottlenecks don't even have any in-universe justifications, they just have the character miraculously escape. The worst part of these bottlenecks is that they could have easily been justified. If Daniel dies outside the church, have John panic out loud so that Taylor can find him and avoid the burn demon. If John is the last man standing, have Andrew proclaim that he isn't losing anyone else and do something he wouldn't ordinarily do to get John out safe. I understand that narrative-heavy games like this need bottlenecks for the sake of development time and resources, but Supermassive has already shown us that they are capable of making them work in-universe with Man of Medan, so why stop putting in the effort here? There are a few other issues I could bring up, like how some of the deaths can be arbitrary, the 70s dream is super linear, or how the climax is a little underwhelming, but these are all flaws that are justified by the narrative, so I'll be bringing them up over the rest of the video. In the meantime, if we're going to talk about Little Hope, we ought to start where the story does. The fire. At the very start of the game, one of the playable characters, Andrew, has a dream that he, now named Anthony, and his classmates are a family living in the 70s. This dream functions as our tutorial. We learn about the dialogue mechanic by talking with your brother, we learn about the picking stuff up mechanic by picking up a box of matches to make tea with, and we get to grips with the controls by exploring this cozy little home. Strange things keep happening around the house whenever Anthony's younger sister Megan is involved. She seems to be acting out against her family after being yelled at, talked about, and generally pushed away. Some of this acting out involves trapping her brother in the attic, locking her mother in the bathroom, and locking her sister on the balcony. This all comes to a head when she puts a doll next to the tea you put on earlier, which starts a house fire. Once the fire starts, you begin to realize just how aggressively linear the opening scene is. The only choice you really get to make is whether your older sister burns to death in a backdraft or necks herself with her scarf. Other than that, you either make meaningless decisions or no decisions. Whether you were polite or bratty with your father, he will always be crushed to death by fiery debris. Whether you were a jerk to your brother or not, he will always slip from the roof and impale himself on a spiked fence. Your mother will always suffocate in the bathroom, your little sister will always burn, and Anthony will always have the matches in hand and be blamed for the incident shortly before running into the blaze himself. Usually, something this linear would be frowned upon in a game like this, but in the case of Little Hope, I think Supermassive made the right decision. But I'm not ready to talk about why just yet. What I will mention is that while this sequence is just a dream, its shadow never really leaves the narrative. As the story continues, you get glimpses of the past, specifically the Little Hope witch trials against the exact doppelgangers of the main cast. As the 1600s gang gets executed, the present-day crew starts getting hunted by demons representing the executed. Angela's doppelganger gets executed first when they tie her in chains and drop her into a lake. From this point on, Angela is hunted by a demon that's bloated and wrapped in chains. Taylor's doppelganger gets burnt at the stake, she gets hunted by a charred demon. Daniel's doppelganger gets dropped onto a spiked metal fence, he gets hunted by a demon impaled by spears. I must admit it is embarrassing that it took me up to this point in my first playthrough to realise that these executions were directly related to the deaths of the family members in the dream. The mother dies of asphyxiation, Angela's doppelganger gets drowned, the older sister burns to death, Taylor's doppelganger gets burnt at the stake. The older brother falls onto a spiked metal fence, Daniel's doppelganger gets dropped onto one, the father gets crushed under debris, John's doppelganger gets crushed under rocks. A cool detail is that if the older sister breaks her neck instead, Taylor's doppelganger will be hung, and the demon chasing Taylor will better match that theme. So clearly that dream was more than just the result of head trauma. But how does it relate to the rest of the story? Well, as you explore the town, you begin to find hints that this dream may have been based more on reality than you had initially thought. When you explore the police station, you can find a commendation for 2 officers who ran into a burning building. When you get to the factory, you can find a picture of the older sister's boyfriend, a picture of the family, and most interestingly of all, a newspaper article that confirms that Anthony survived the event and was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing when the fire department discovered the doll. This all comes to a head when you reach the end of the game, which takes place in the charred remains of the house from Andrew's dream. No matter which ending you get from here, you discover that the fire was the catalyst for the entire story. Andrew doesn't just look like Anthony, he is Anthony, now middle-aged and bearing both physical and psychological scars from the fire. Having to drive a bus through his old hometown triggered a survivor's guilt-induced hallucination, where his family was alive but being hunted by monsters that wanted them to meet the same fate as the real family they represented. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Surely that isn't okay. The people you've gotten to know, the witch trials you witnessed, the monsters pursuing you, it was all fake? And yes, but also no. If you recall my Man and Medan video, I was fairly critical of the fake monsters. While they did offer some interesting situations mechanically, they left a lot to be desired in most other areas. In particular, you will recall that my main issue was that Man and Medan's hallucinations didn't tell us anything about the characters that we didn't already know. Little Hope turns that on its head. On a surface level, the hallucination is a way for Anthony to come to terms with the loss he suffered as a young adult, and even gain some wish fulfillment from it. While Anthony was powerless to save his loved ones, Andrew gets several chances throughout the game to do just that. He pulls Angela out of harm's way, rescues Taylor at the church, tries to pull Daniel up in the factory, and helps John with the crush demon outside the ruined house. But imagining a scenario where he gets to save the day can't be healthy for a grief-stricken man. So Little Hope does something kind of interesting. You'll recall when I was talking about the game's flaws earlier that I mentioned arbitrary deaths and an underwhelming climax. Well, here's where we're going to get into it. Throughout the game, every character who isn't Andrew gets something called a hero moment. When Taylor gets ambushed by whichever demon is hunting her, she gets a dialogue choice. She can either beg for help,
Help me! Don't let go!
or tell whoever is trying to help her to escape.
Leave me! Get out of here with the others!
After Daniel falls through the factory floor, when Andrew is trying to help him up, he can either cling on to Andrew,
I need to get out of here!
or he can let go and tell the others to keep moving.
Go!
When John decides to fight the crush demon, Angela can either deride him,
I'm not waiting around to watch you get yourself killed! This is suicide!
or ask him to be careful.
John, please hurry!
And finally, when John is holding the door shut to keep the crush demon out, he can either beg Andrew for help,
Andrew! Andrew! I need you here!
or tell everyone to get away.
This thing is only interested in me! Get out of here! Go!
You'll notice that there's a running theme throughout most of these scenarios. When you consider that they're all figments of Anthony's delusion, they all come down to a single question. Are you willing to let them go? This actually creates a nice sense of ludonarrative synchronicity. Anthony doesn't want to let his family go, but we as players will likely feel the same. In my first playthrough, I failed Daniel's hero moment, because I was worried that he'd die if I made that choice. I wasn't willing to let him go, and I paid the price for it. Any characters who fail their hero moments are doomed. When you reach the end of Little Hope, Andrew leaves the ruined house, and anyone who didn't pass their hero moment gets trapped inside and killed by their demons. I say it's an arbitrary death because whether a character lives or not is basically dependent on a single decision. At least Matt's death in Until Dawn needed a few choices to happen. And the fact that you get no opportunity to interact with the climax is what makes it a bit of a letdown. Unless, of course, no one stayed in the house, in which case there just is no climax. But I'm willing to accept some mechanical downgrade if it's good for the story, and the idea that you need to let characters go to keep them alive is a narrative element well worth the arbitrary deaths and blasé climax. This is the point of the main story. Anthony's family is gone. There was nothing he could have done to save them, hence why the aggressive linearity of that sequence was a good choice for the narrative. Anthony has to let go of his family one way or another. He can either let go of his own accord and come to peace with the fact that they are gone, or he'll be forced to relive his trauma, again, and again, and again. But there's one thing missing from all this. Anthony's delusion has representations of his older sister, brother, mother, and father. But what about his younger sister, the one who arguably started the fire? Well, the game has a different question in regards to Megan. Can Anthony find it in himself to forgive her? The main cast of Little Hope are not the only ones who have doppelgangers during the witch trial segments. 2 more characters fit this criterion, and one of them is Anthony's little sister Megan. Megan's doppelganger is named Mary, and throughout the flashbacks she is the catalyst for every execution that we see. She's a more willing participant in some accusations than others, but in every case, through action or inaction, she is directly involved in condemning the other doppelgangers. Everyone in the main cast except for Andrew will be actively hostile towards Mary. They'll blame her for the executions, the resulting demons, and ultimately decide that they need to do whatever they can to stop her, regardless of what that might involve. In most cases where Mary is discussed, the player will be in control of Andrew, and as such you get to decide how he feels about her, whether he defends her or sides with his classmates. This all comes to a head in the ruined house when you get the final flashback. Mary is on trial for witchcraft and begs Andrew for help. It is here that the player decides the fate of Mary and the attitude that Anthony has toward Megan. Will you condemn Mary for what she has done? Or will you expose the true antagonist of the flashbacks? The second doppelganger I mentioned is that of a reverend, who was in charge of the church while the 70s family was alive. His doppelganger's name is Reverend Carver, and he is a total creeper from the first moment you meet him.
I will release you once I am sure you will not speak of our secret.
He's a sadistic and cruel man who ultimately masterminded the witch trials in order to accrue land which gave his family the power they needed to ruin the town shortly after the fire. Exposing this scheme isn't how you save Mary though. That involves exposing his interest in the occult. This relates to his 70s counterpart who also had an interest in the occult and was Megan's mentor, something which she clearly was not fond of. But for reasons I'll be getting into shortly, none of that really matters. The metaphor here is not difficult to work out. Mary was involved in the executions of the doppelgangers, just as Anthony feels Megan is responsible for the destruction of his family. While you spend the game coming to grips with whether you agree with that sentiment or not, the ultimate decision comes at the very end, when you are given one of 3 choices. Condemn Mary, burn the puppet, or blame Carver. Condemning Mary is Anthony deciding that Megan is to blame for the fire. Mary will chew Andrew out for being a terrible carer and be burned at the stake. Yet another example of Anthony having to relive his trauma. Burning the puppet is a weak cop-out. An Anthony who can't blame or forgive Megan for the fire, seemingly electing to blame the doll instead. The game calls you out for this indecisive stance. If you choose to destroy the puppet, it will burn down the courthouse, supposedly killing everyone inside. Blaming Carver is Anthony's way of forgiving Megan, of deciding that she cannot be held accountable for what happened and that the blame lies elsewhere. This is arguably the best outcome for these flashbacks. Anthony knows that Megan didn't act maliciously. He even admits this to himself before the final decision.
It was never my intention to bring harm to this town or its people.
But it still doesn't sit right. Does it? Was Reverend Carson really responsible for Megan's behaviour that night? Sure, he was fond of the occult, arrested for practicing these beliefs years later, and Megan is seemingly followed by a demon within the home. But can Carson really be blamed for the fire? Or is this just another deflection? A way for Anthony to make sense of the tragedy that ruined his life? No, it can't be, right? I mean, we saw Megan on the night of the fire. Even if the fire itself was an accident, she undoubtedly made the situation worse. She locked her mother in the bathroom, trapped her brother in the attic, and locked her sister on the balcony. Or did she? You might have noticed that I referred to the house fire segment of the game as a dream. That wasn't just to preserve the twist for viewers who hadn't played the game. There is evidence that what we witness in this sequence should not be taken literally. Now, this isn't actually something I noticed on my own. This was discussed in a video by Hidden Object Guru, who is mandatory watching for any Dark Pictures anthology fans. The theory says that while Anthony's dream is based on the real fire, it's a retelling that tries to explain the tragedy by painting Megan as malicious. But there are hints in the ruined house and the dream itself that this isn't the case. We never see her lock the older sister out, mess with the ladder to the attic, or lock her mother in the bathroom. The only reason we believe she did the last one is that she was holding a key that supposedly locked the bathroom door. But when you explore the house in the final level, one of the clues is a grandfather clock concealing the very same key that Megan is shown to be holding. Is it not possible that the mother just never made it out of the bathroom? That the older sister was locked out because the balcony door sticks just like the front door does? Or that the older brother could have used the ladder to get into the house, but decided not to because of the smoke? It's possible that all Megan really did was put her doll down next to the stove, not considering that it could fall over. The final nail in the coffin for me in regards to this theory is something that Mary says if you condemn her.
No! This is all on your head!
It's Anthony's broken psyche trying in vain to reconsider, but if this is the path you have chosen, by the time you hear this, it's already too late. Whatever decision you make, both in regards to Mary and your classmates, it is after this final flashback that we get to the climax of the game, and the player is presented with their ending. Let me get the most anticlimactic ending out of the way first. Throughout the game you interact with a local named Vince. Vince consistently acts odd and like he'd really rather not be talking to you. We learn as the game goes on that he was your older sister's boyfriend, and for the longest time has blamed Anthony for the fire. If you treat Vince antagonistically throughout the game, especially if you shoot at the demon behind him, he will continue to blame you.
The only place you should be heading is hell, you goddamn murdering son of a bitch.
And the game will end with Anthony being taken away by the police. This can be a good or bad ending depending on other decisions you've made, but it's certainly anticlimactic as it has no closure for Anthony at all. In order to avoid this ending, you need to be genuine or desperate with Vince.
Please, we're all out of options here.
And he responds rather well.
You and me both, man.
When you consider that Andrew is just Anthony living a delusion, this is basically two trauma survivors confiding in each other.
Shutting people out don't help. And believe me, I know.
If your relationship with Vince is good, he will find you at the end of the game, having come to terms with his own trauma. He says that he no longer blames you and encourages you to move on from Little Hope.
I'm real sorry. I know it wasn't your fault. You call for help and you leave this place. And don't you ever come back. Ain't nothing left here for you.
It is after this that you'll get the ending decided by your choices. And I'm going to issue another content warning here, because some of these can get a little grim. You know who I haven't mentioned in this video yet? The curator. He's back and just as cryptic as ever, but he has no involvement in the plot, so he was hardly worth bringing up. At first, it seemed as though he was even less involved, as in Man of Medan, he would show up in random spots. Turns out those appearances weren't random. He would show up during moments when a character was potentially close to death. He'll show up on the Duke of Milan before Conrad tries to escape. He'll show up behind Fliss before she reunites with Brad. And he'll show up when Alex and Julia are running from Olsen. As I played through Little Hope, I figured that Supermassive just stopped doing that for this game and barely thought about it afterwards. I was wrong. Turns out he doesn't show up for character deaths in this game because those characters aren't real. There is one and only one scenario where the curator will appear, and that is if Andrew is the last man standing after the house and has condemned Mary to die. Andrew sits in front of the ruined house all alone. He has failed to let his family go and failed to forgive Megan, and so he has been forced to relive the trauma of losing them. He pulls out a pistol that he had found earlier and prepares to fire on himself. As he is pointing the gun, Megan appears to him. She's burned and bloody. She screams at him as though in agony. This jump scare affects him as bad as the player, and he pulls the trigger. Unable to cope with the trauma of losing everything at such a young age, Andrew, and therefore Anthony, takes his own life. This is the worst ending you can get. It can be interrupted by the police if you're antagonistic with Vince, but without that intervention, you're given an ending where a broken man is caught by his own demon. The second ending I'd like to discuss is a little more bittersweet. In this ending, Andrew is the last man standing at the house. All the other main cast have died over the course of the story or got trapped at the very end. But when asked the ultimate question about Mary, Andrew spared her. This ending begins very much like the last. Andrew puts a gun to his head, but when Megan appears to him, she looks like her usual self and pushes the gun away. Once Andrew is revealed to be Anthony, he puts the gun down. In this ending, a broken man is forced to relive his trauma, but finds solace in the fact that he is able to forgive his sister for the role she played. Third and finally is what most people consider to be the good ending. In this ending, everyone survives and Mary is spared. The group all leave the house together and make their way to a diner outside of town. Once they make it, Andrew apologizes to the group for everything he has put them through. He hears reassurances from his classmates as the delusion wears off.
You're not alone here.
Take it easy on
We've all
yourself.
been through
You know
hell.
that, right?
We're finally getting out of this
Can't
hell.
blame yourself.
It was a tragic accident. This is an ending in which a broken man has faced his trauma head-on, let go of the family that he lost, and let go of his anger at his sister and himself. There's no one to blame, no purpose to the incident, and no meaning to be found in it. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't Megan's fault. It was a tragic accident. This doesn't mean that Anthony is cured of his PTS. Not even close. But this delusion has helped him come to terms with what happened to him and started him on a path of healing. While there is no turning back the clock, Anthony can now move forward. This ending is what nearly brought me to tears. An ending in which a broken man can finally begin to put himself back together. Do you know what this video has been light on? Comparisons to Until Dawn. Man of Medan was so desperate to keep up with its older sibling that it felt appropriate to judge it by those standards. Little Hope is a completely different beast, but for the sake of you who are curious, here's what I've got. As horror games, Until Dawn still takes the cake. It has better stakes, it's more thrilling, it's a better put together game, and its characters are better written. But as good as it is as an ode to old horror films, it doesn't have much going on in terms of themes or character arcs. As a drama, as a tragedy, as a character study on the effects of trauma and survivor's guilt, Little Hope reigns supreme. Sure, it's janky, the narrative wasn't as adaptive as its predecessor, and it was all a dream in the end. But it's a game that makes me feel something, that gives me a story I need to pay attention to and rewards me for thinking about it. And as someone who has been running a narrative analysis channel for 4 years, that's about all I can ask from a story. Let's see if House of Ashes can do the same. I'd like to thank my patrons, Orion Tran, Lars Espen, Data52, Jaman5, Pixcalibur, Tyler Bennett, Tenka, Jeremy Pashik, Fireclaw, Chris, Will, Luke Stewart, Ignacio, Swiss Cage, Stage 4 Boss, Gerald, and John. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.